Hi everyone, and welcome to the day one wrap up of the Risk Awareness Week. And what an amazing day we had! And this is a live session, so right underneath this video, if you're watching this on LinkedIn, do comment. If you're watching this on YouTube, please say hello and comment. I will see it. And I wanted to summarize all the workshops that we had in day one, and kind of I prioritized them in a story where you can kind of watch them in a sequence, and that it will all make complete sense. So first of all, a few questions that people have been asking me throughout the day. Because this is a 21st century virtual conference, you don't have to be online during the actual workshop time. You can watch the replay at any time on any device where you will be where you have capacity to do so. And you can still ask questions because I transfer all of the questions to the speakers. You can still ask questions on the conference website below the video, and I'll translate those questions to the speakers, and then the speakers will respond immediately directly to your question, or I'll kind of copy paste the response back to you. So that's number one. Number two, all the paid participants still get CPD credits for the workshops that you watch, and the system, the conference website tracks what you watch and when you watch. So don't worry about that. You don't have to be live for the CPD certificate to be activated. You will still receive that. All of the CPD certificates will be issued at the end of the week, at the end of the conference, and circulated via email next week. From that, you can print it, you can add it to your LinkedIn, and you can save it as a PDF. You can do all sorts of different things with the certificate. All the replays are available forever, and on the conference website, which is, by the way, just a reminder, 2022 at riskawarenessweek.com. There's a new link in the header called replays, and there you can watch all of the replays from the previous day. And in fact, replays, next to them, you can see kind of an indication on the upvotes each of the workshops got, so you can kind of judge, which were kind of the better hit with the audience, which ones got more likes, and so on. So, and don't forget to upvote this workshop if you want me to continue doing daily debriefs for the conference. And feel free to ask questions in comments. Share your experience, share your thoughts from the day one conference. You've just had 8 different workshops, a lot of content. So let me know what you think. In the meantime, I have prepared a debrief with key messages on all of the workshops, and I've grouped them not in chronological order, but in in the kind of in the logical narrative, where you can kind of move from one logical conclusion to the next, and kind of get the complete picture. So first, and this is the order of watching replays recommended by me. You may have a different opinion, and this is just going from introduction into background, into context, into theory, into kind of practical application. So being last doesn't mean this workshop wasn't good. It just means that this was the most practical workshop during the day. So my recommendation is start with the workshop that I did in the morning, because I try to set the context and cover cover three kind of fundamental points. First, I talked about a little bit about what is risk and how, in the world of risk management too, risk is not a number, not a color, not a word. Risk is a distribution, and it always is a distribution. And in fact, you can add distributions together, you can multiply distributions together, you can correlate distributions and recalculate aggregate distribution. So all sorts of mathematical manipulations you can do with risks as soon as you start treating risks as distributions, as they were always intended 500 years ago, when kind of probability theory just started developing. So I talked about what is risk in the world of risk management too, because in the world of risk management too, risk is something significantly different from what most regulators or um, best practices think. And second point that I talked about, very important, I talked about three levels of risk analysis and how each of the levels, the basic, the standardized, the advanced, how each of the levels solves a completely different purpose. You can use basic level risk register, quantitative risk register, to improve your budgeting, to improve your insurance decisions, to improve your liquidity and cash flow forecasting decisions. But that's about it. If you wanted to start talking about mitigations and different effectiveness of different controls or measure effectiveness of controls, you have to go to the standardized level, which is where we deep dive into a specific risk and use techniques like bow ties, stochastic or quantitative bow ties, to give us additional insight into the nature of a particular risk. And then, of course, if we have a multi-million-dollar problem, then we need something more sophisticated, more complex, like a tailor-made model specifically designed for that problem. And again, I hinted at one of the examples of those models calculators that we created together with Archer Insight team. But I'm actually going to do a full presentation, like in-depth presentation of the logic, because you can apply the same logic to all sorts of problems. In my previous role, created calculators for water pollution, air pollution, um, uh, ammonia transportation, insurance, quality, operational risks, property damage, business interruption, and resource usage in production facilities. So all sorts of calculators that you can replicate and help you quantify different types of risks and hence improve the decision making. So that was the first session. I recommend starting with that because that was kind of a nice context setting. Then second, I would recommend watching the session by Doug Hubbard because he talked about the place risk management has in the broader context of decision making and how risk management techniques play an important part but are not all of the story. There's a bigger story, and in fact there are um, there are parts of decision making process that become prerequisites for proper risk analysis. In fact, until you kind of fix some of the important steps in the decision making process in different decision making processes, because there's no single decision making process. There's budgeting is one decision process, pricing for products is another decision making process, investment decision it's a third decision making process. So he talked about how risk management starts to work best when you actually involve yourself as the team into upgrading the decision processes and when they are mature, because so you may need to start fixing the decision cycles first before you can do proper risk analysis. And then the final message that Doug was saying, and I highly recommend his workshop. The final message that Doug was saying is how tracking performance and backtesting the quality of our risk analysis is so important, because what we may intuitively think is good or bad may be completely different in real life. So my recommendation is, second thing, watch Doug's workshop. Then my third order is actually moving almost to the last part of the day, is the workshop done by Hank Cranen and Diana Delbel Beluz, because they continue this kind of merging of two disciplines. They continue this journey of merging two disciplines, because what they've done is that they hypothesis, which I completely agree with, and in fact this is what I and my team have been doing for years, that risk managers can learn a lot from decision quality. There's this whole science called decision science, and this science is actually much older than the ERM modern risk management. It's at least 2 to 3 times older than the corporate risk management, your enterprise integrated risk things. So we can, they're the older brother, not risk management. The probability theory is very old, but the kind of the corporate risk management is actually one of the youngest management disciplines out there. So we can, they argue that we can learn from decision quality, and I completely agree with that. And so they actually make a very nice bridge, they build a very nice bridge, making reference from, at the risk identification stage, what are some of the techniques we can borrow from decision science? At the risk analysis, risk assessment stage, what are some of the techniques that we can borrow from decision science? And I mean, I would know, because that's exactly what my team has been doing forever. We've been borrowing tools and techniques from decision science and applying them to risk management, significantly outperforming purely risk management techniques. It's not that difficult to outperform a heat map, to be completely honest. And then the final chapter of the conversation is that the techniques we can borrow um, from decision science on risk appetite and trade-offs. I mean, this is probably the least understood part of risk management. And rather than recreating the wheel and doing a very horrible job out of it, because risk appetite is what a mess risk managers have created. By the way, I recommend um, later in the week to catch David Vose's workshop, because he is going to talk about kind of making sense with this whole risk appetite and trade-off conversation. So number three, I recommend Hank's and Diana's workshop. Number four, now we're kind of moving into the specifics. So first three workshops is kind of setting the foundation. The basic messages are um, risk management, especially quantitative risk management, is not new. We don't have to start from scratch. We don't have to recreate the wheel. We can actually borrow a lot from decision science, probability theory, and neuroscience. These three sciences have existed for a long time. They have a toolkit which has been tested, validated, and shows quite decent performance in improving the quality of decisions. So rather than creating something fresh and new, which is my pet peeve, I hate when people try and create something when they haven't actually tested and measured the effectiveness of existing techniques. Um, Rather than create something new, we should borrow from the sister disciplines. I don't know, let's call it that, sister disciplines. And so that was that was setting the context. And now we move into more specific kind of targeted practical examples of, well, what does that mean? So number four, I recommend Grant Purdy's workshop, where he again reinforces the message that if you want risk management to add value, it has to be connected to specific decisions that executives and the board are making within the organization first, and then you cascade it down into all the other important decisions. Um, and quality of decision making, or decision quality, is absolutely fundamental. And one of the biggest mistakes that organizations are making is that they assume that just because the person holds a senior position and has a lot of experience, they must be really good at making decisions. Well, a lot of research suggests that that may not actually be the case. In fact, probably the most famous is Philip Tetlock's book Super Forecasting, where he studied 80,000 forecasts from some of the kind of famous world and just general people as well as famous forecasters, their ability to rely on their experience and provide forecasts that have, you know, minimum or error smaller than you would have got if you just kind of used an algorithm. And his conclusion is that he found no discipline on earth where human judgment or intuition would significantly outperform just even the most basic algorithms. Um, so Graham is kind of Grant is kind of picking up on that, and he's then going into kind of a very specific, narrow field of decision quality, explaining how important it is to look into the assumptions and check the assumptions, check the reasonableness of assumptions, check the quality of assumptions that management makes. So I highly recommend that workshop as number 4, because that kind of begins your transition into this decision discipline or application of risk into decision. Because the practicality of checking for assumptions, by the way, assumptions check is one of the famous CIA tools which I use all the time in my work. And it basically implies whenever you're making a decision, your decision is always based on a lot of assumptions. It could be foreign exchange rate, it could be time, delivery times, it could be costs, it could be inflation, it could be demand, it could be supply, it could be, yeah, all sorts of assumptions. And one of the things humans are not very good at is that we just assume that because somebody put an assumption somewhere, somebody made an assumption, it's actually based on some sort of objective view of reality. And that's one of the problem. And then the other part of the problem that Sam Savage is talking about, and that's my next recommended workshop in number 5, is that whenever your assumption is a single point estimate instead of a range, it hides all the uncertainty, and therefore you lose that important part of risk analysis where you're trying to come back saying, well, the decision, your forecast is 100, but we can actually measure that the probability of it being 100 is 5% or 10%. I had that experience in my life when the management was presenting a strategy, a 5-year strategy, and we did the calculation. And I told this story so many times, but we did the calculation, and the probability of achieving that strategy without any cash deficits was 0.000003%, which basically meant that the strategy was overly optimistic, disregarding the underlying risk exposure, and so the strategy was rewritten as the result. So my number 5 is my conversation with Sam Savage, where Sam did most of the talking. I mean, I was just there for facilitation purposes. He's kind of taking that idea of we need to replace single point assumptions with ranges, and he gives a very nice introduction into thinking in ranges, and he provides a lot of examples and illustrations, very simple illustrations, when as soon as you add a little bit of uncertainty, a little bit of range around some of the assumptions, a lot of the traditional kind of common approaches fall apart, immediately fall apart. So I recommend watching his workshop after Grant's, because Grant talks about how it is important to identify the assumptions and challenge the assumptions, and then to kind of realize that actually assumptions are not single point estimates, they're ranges. And then Sam illustrates, well, what do you do with those ranges? Now, we had a small hiccup today. I uploaded the wrong workshop by Norman Marks, so I'm not going to include it in this lineup today because it was last year's workshop. As soon as I re-upload Norman's workshop, I'll have like a separate stream talking about that, and you obviously will all be invited to revisit and rewatch this year's session that Norman did. So number 5 for me was Sam Savage, in the logical order of this narrative. Now, number 6, there was a workshop by Darlene Halwalls, Angela Hoon, and Christina Martinez, who talked about the biggest challenges risk managers need to overcome when integrating risk management into decision making. And I thought that was a very nice grounding. We talked about the hypothetical. How do you change? You need to change. You need to challenge the assumptions. You need to replace assumptions with ranges. You need to simulate the results. But how do you actually go about talking about that? How do you start the conversation? Which is, in all of our experience, is not an easy task, because the mathematical side of risk analysis most of the time is kindergarten for a generator. And if you remember, I talk about generators versus users. Just like with electricity, somebody generates the electricity, and most of us have no idea how they've done it, but we still use it, and we have no trouble using it without even understanding how it's done. And so it's the same with probabilities. Somebody needs to generate the probabilities, and we call them generators, and they know exactly what they need to do. They know how to overcome data quality issues, not enough data. Like they know how to deal with all of these typical excuses that people ask. And the reason people continue asking and kind of telling those excuses is just that they're not generators. Because if you're a generator, you have mathematical theories and approaches and techniques for dealing with most of the problems that users think are unsolvable. For example, my favorite is, how do you aggregate political risk or sanctions or health and safety risks with financial risks? Well, that sounds completely unmanageable, and yet there's the whole utility theory that deals with that like this. And you just need to find the person who's done that, and then they can do it for you, or they can teach you how to do it. Although I think it may be difficult to learn something that people have been learning for decades. So anyway, um, the workshop on the challenges of integrating risk management in decision making. So that was a very powerful workshop, because and by all, do listen to it, because these are the three experiences from different CROs and senior risk executives who have lived through the selling process, and they're sharing the kind of their pain and their stories and their success stories. And I'm just going to mention a few things that stood out to me. So the biggest challenge in their opinion, is getting support from different people, because when you have a single decision maker, it's actually much more difficult to get support from that person than if you have a group. For example, it's much easier to get support from the board or an audit committee, because there are different individuals, and even if you don't hit the mark with one, you still have you can save your bets and convince a few other people, and then the majority convinces everybody else. But if you have a single decision maker, if he didn't like something, if he said no, then it's much more difficult to convince that person. So um, getting support from different kinds of people, and all of tomorrow is dedicated to understanding how human brain works and what sort of types of personalities humans have, and uh, why it's important to package the same message differently for different stakeholders. That's all of tomorrow. Don't miss that. Um, so changing decision making and getting support from different kinds of people, that those are the major kind of um, challenges. And um, the kind of the success stories were happening when the risk manager is patient. He takes his time. He builds the business case. By the way, number 7 on my list is how to build a business case. I'll mention that in a second. And realizing that making decisions transparent sounds good on paper, but it's actually going to step on a lot of toes in the organization. So risk managers have to be mentally prepared for that. They have to think 3 steps ahead. It's a little, jokingly saying I have with my wife. Risk managers think 3 steps ahead, and not just think, well, what you're going to do, and then what the opponent going to do, but then what your response will be, but then what their response, and then what your secondary response will be. So that was a good point. And the one thing that stood out to me, which is exactly what we use in our organization as well, is whenever you're testing a new methodology or a new approach, or whenever you want to try something, we never started with the whole kind of organization. We always use pilots. We pilot tested something like we would take one risk at a time. For example, we would take water pollution, and we would create a quantitative calculator for water pollution, and then we would roll it out to air pollution, and then we would roll it out to soil pollution, or for example, we would take a credit risk, and we would quantify it on a single geography, and then we will roll it out to a different region, and so on. So pilot testing everything was the kind of the key standout for me from that session. But you really need to listen, because it's just the experience, the wealth of experience that the ladies had is very inspiring. And the final message that I took away from that workshop is that risk management is kind of this center of competencies for modeling or quantifying uncertainty or dealing with uncertainty, and they're almost like the in-house service provider, just like the tax department is the service provider to the rest of the organization. Whenever somebody deals with the tax, with an issue or with a decision that has some sort of tax implications, they call upon the tax experts to help them deal with that. Well, it's exactly the same. Whenever somebody is making a decision that has a lot of uncertainty associated with that, they would call upon the risk professionals to help them quantify or deal with that uncertainty. So that was my number 6. My number 7 is Scott Mitchell, who created a 15-step, quite detailed, quite sophisticated, very simple to understand, and very powerful um, business. It's a blueprint for creating a business case to help you as risk professionals sell new ideas to the business. So I highly recommend watching that towards kind of the end of your journey for day one, because it gives you very concrete, very specific 15 steps that you can take to make sure your business case is actually gonna achieve the result that you wish to achieve. And I mean, I suspect most of you have probably experienced. We may do some amazing work, and risk analysis is very solid, and we are proud of the quantification that we've done, only to undersell it to the decision makers, and they don't realize how groundbreaking or how important it is, and so they just park it to the side, kind of waiting for a better moment. And you wasted so much effort on creating something that just didn't actually hit the mark. So that's my number 7, highly recommended. And then number 8 is I recommend watching Alex's Dali workshop, because it brings it all together into practical sense. Some of the key principles in ISO 31000, Alex is trying to link it with specific applications in specific practical, tangible applications in your work. So that's my summary from day one. We are live. I can answer questions or thoughts or ideas from you. So by all means, I'll stick around for a little longer online. Please ask your questions, and I'll try and respond to them. If you had any questions on other workshops, maybe that as you know, in my last 3 roles, I was senior risk executive in different industries, different countries, and I have a lot of stories on what worked, what didn't work. So ask away. Okay. If no more questions, then enjoy the remaining 4 days of Risk Awareness Week. Remember, you don't have to stress about the time frames, and you don't have to stress about the early nights or late evening workshops, because you can watch the replays forever on any device. Um, just don't worry about it. Enjoy it. Risk Awareness Week is designed to be this amazing learning experience where each of the workshop has a lot of practical value to your careers in risk management and to your kind of better understanding of the underlying sciences of risk. And you can take time to study it. You don't have to rush. Thank you, and I'll see you tomorrow. I'm gonna do this same kind of day debrief at the end of each day for 5 days, and then I'm also doing a workshop on Wednesday on quantifying risks for insurance purposes. But insurance is just an example. It's a very important workshop on understanding how we build tailor-made models for specific complex problems where the savings from spending like a month on quantifying something, the savings were millions of dollars. Not hypothetical millions, literal millions that, paid for our salaries and bonuses and all the admin costs for the next 10 years as the risk team. So thank you very much, and I will see you tomorrow.